This is part 2 in the lectures on American literary modernism. I'm going to switch over into our full screen view now. To recap where the part 1 lecture left off, we are looking at modernism and what artists believed. And the beliefs of artists extended into the beliefs of writers, authors who wrote what we would classify as literature in this time period, roughly 1910 to 1945. A main takeaway to review where we left off with the last lecture is that art doesn't have to have a useful purpose, or it doesn't have to have a moral message, doesn't have to have a social message. It might just be beautiful, it might just be ugly, and it's art for the sake of art only. During this time period, we see the rise of Cubism. You might have seen this image before. It's a very famous Picasso painting. And what this image does is break down forms into simple shapes. So we see the human body in geometrical forms here. Lots of triangles, squares, rhombuses. Little dial back into my geometry memories here, thinking of the different shapes that we have. We also have a use of changing perspectives. So if you look at this lady here, we're actually looking at her back, but her face is facing forward. So we have not only changing perspectives, but distortion and deformity. We have abstraction, so it doesn't look like real people. We can recognize that they're people, but it's not realistic. These are unnatural looking objects down here. It's a plate that has some fruit on here. Unnatural proportions, like the arms might be huge, or the leg. I mean, this leg just turned into like a slab, kind of like a slab of meat here. It's unnatural in the way it's composed. So again, just not realistic. It's fragmented, so it's all chopped up. There's parts left off. If you look closely, you can, where's some of their hands and things. Like sometimes we have a realistic looking hand, kind of, and then there's blobs and so on. There's a lot of repetition of shapes in here, and there's exaggeration, to say the least. The scene is called Les Demoiselles d'Avignon, which means like the young ladies of Avignon, and it was actually a portrait of prostitutes that he painted. And Picasso was also using heavy symbolism here. This is meant to be like an African mask. The Cubist writers studied art from around the world, and there was a belief in some African cultures that masks could ward off venereal disease. So he places this mask, this African-style mask, on a prostitute's face to symbolically comment on preventing venereal disease. We even have the sky chopped up. I love how you can, once you know what's going on here, tell that this is a sky with some clouds in it and things. So this will have a lot to do with the poetry we read in class, and we're going to dip into that now and see where this goes. In this course, we have considered representations of reality the entire semester, from Puritanism to rationalism to realism to naturalism, and now modernism. With Puritanism, we had a great focus on God and religion, and representations of reality that we saw through a Puritan lens almost exclusively would have the hand of God on them from the way that the Puritan writers wrote. The rationalist writers, when we're looking at the era of the American Revolution, Thomas Jefferson and so on, we would see an influence of science and a desire to have representations of reality match up what could be scientifically observed. I left Romanticism off. I'm going to keep going though for the sake of time. I'll put it back in the slide. Well, I'll just do it live here as part of the recording. Okay, because we can't leave Romanticism out. So let's hop back into this view of it. We have Romanticism. Whoops. I can't type right now in my live recording. I can't type when people are looking at me too, like when I'm standing in front of a classroom of people. I don't know what it is. Romanticism. There we go. So a romantic view of reality, and romantic with our capital R, has a great emphasis on the imagination, and we might see beautiful nature scenes, landscapes, that type of thing. Realism, getting more into the gritty realities of life. Naturalism, and even more extreme extension of that with the brutalities of life and an indifferent universe. And now we have modernism, where anything that we might have thought of been remotely realistic for any of those movements really goes off the rails with what we begin to see in art. In modern poetry and stories, we see deliberate ambiguity. I want to emphasize that so much. So one of the things that's incredibly frustrating for students is in literature classes, there isn't always an answer. Or if we're interpreting something, it could be one way, it could be another. You have writers who are deliberately constructing ambiguity. And a lot of times, this can be very off-putting to students who interpret it as feeling inadequate about being able to respond to something. What I want to do is kind of flip that script some and say, look, a lot of the time when we're reading writings that are meant to be deliberately ambiguous, we have our authors that are messing with us on purpose. They're making it hard to interpret it. They're making it hard to understand. So it is very much acceptable and desired to come into a piece of modern art and reading and say, I don't really understand what they want here from me as a reader. That is normal. The reason that happens is we're given multiple perspectives. So sometimes we get point of views in authors. In novels from this period, we might have a chapter narrated by one character in a family and another chapter narrated by a different member of the family after that, and it might go back and forth. And sometimes you may not even know who is the narrator for a while. Very hard to figure out. So we have an emphasis on experimentation with characters and form and voice, a rejection of convention, and some borrowing from the past too. So let me pause on that for a second. Rejection of convention means, okay, we're not going to do things the way they've always been done. We're going to move away from tradition. Can't do that entirely. I mean, it's kind of impossible. But the borrowing from the past, it is almost in some ways skipping over realism and naturalism and going back to romanticism, because to do any of these things we're talking about with multiple perspectives and shifting around and fragmentation, it has to get back into the ideas of a shifting reality and the imagination, which takes us to romanticism. I'll pick up our next slide after this in our next lecture.